Hello, good afternoon, good morning, good night. Nowadays one never knows where people are dialing in from. Excuse the slight delay. We are still waiting for participants to sign in. Maybe give it a couple of seconds. And then I just cut my introduction short, which is the least interesting part of this whole seminar anyway. Anyway, my name is Frederick Kliem. I'm a visiting fellow at RSIS at the Center for Multilateralism Studies, and I welcome you all warmly on behalf of myself, of my center, and of my colleague Joel, also at the CMS, Center for Multilateralism Studies, with whom I have conceived this webinar series together, which will run over 3 days, today, tomorrow, and day after tomorrow, same time. At the Center for Multilateralism Studies here at RSIS, research, we teach, and we engage in capacity building on cooperative multilateralism in the Indo-Pacific region. And we, particular, those people who have been engaged in the seminar from our center, take close interest in ASEAN in this regard, in our immediate region. We watch, we study, we publish, we teach on ASEAN matters on both the diplomatic and political front, but also from an IPE, a political economy perspective. So in any case, we are very happy and we are a little bit proud to present this webinar series today over the next 3 days, because originally we had planned this seminar as a physical conference in February. And then some of you who are registered for the webinar series now had also signed up for the physical conference as well. We are pleased to see you now, even though it's only online. We had planned it then as ASEAN had just released its outlook on the Indo-Pacific, and we planned the physical event as ASEAN's outlook on the Indo-Pacific and the future of ASEAN Centrality. Quite a cutting-edge, up-to-date topic, it seemed at that time. And then we were curious to find out how the outlook would reinforce ASEAN centrality or not. What needs to happen in order to reinforce ASEAN centrality? What needs to happen to create synergies among ASEAN's many existing mechanisms? In other words, what do we need to do? What do we need to look out for to turn the outlook on the Indo-Pacific from words and rhetoric into concrete action? And then, we all know COVID-19 turned the year 2020 into one of the worst years in recent memory, and we had to cancel this event and turn it into a webinar series. Anyway, so here we are now. More than a change of just format, we had, well, in fact, how can you discuss anything nowadays without accounting for COVID-19 too? So as you can see in the description, in the invitation email, we have slightly changed the theme as well. It now reads ASEAN's outlook on the Indo-Pacific. So far, so good. COVID-19 and the future of ASEAN centrality. So you may ask, what has COVID-19 at all to do with ASEAN centrality? Well, then you are at the right place. Maybe nothing, maybe a plenty. I'm sure we will find out today and tomorrow and the day after. Specifically today, we are concentrating on the broader effect of COVID-19 that COVID-19 may or may not have on multilateralism in the region. Although logic would suggest that a borderless global pandemic is the best case you can possibly make for multilateral cooperation ever, the reality is somewhat different and not quite living up for this. So there are organizational questions such as how can a virtual summit in ASEAN work, in ASEAN in which consensus building is as important as it is difficult to reach? Can virtual summits achieve this? You could ask questions such as how much of a loss is the indefinitely postponed US ASEAN summit to centrality, postponed of course due to COVID-19. But also on a more optimistic note, what are opportunities for cooperation, for regionalism, multilateral cooperation in general amidst the COVID-19 disruption? How can multilateralism be strengthened amidst the decreasing interest, perhaps, as a larger trend in multilateralism and increasing great power competition and so forth. So all this and much more, I'm very much looking forward to discuss today with you, dear participants, but also with our 3 excellent speakers. It's my absolute greatest pleasure on my behalf, on my center's behalf, to welcome them all. And I will introduce them briefly in order of their appearance here. We have Hoang, who is the lead researcher for political and security affairs at the ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute here in Singapore, although I understand she is currently personally not in Singapore, but in a webinar that matters little. I've got to know Ha personally as a great authority on ASEAN and ASEAN's role in matters of regional security. And on a little side note, Ha is the only person I have ever met who literally knows all of the 1 billion ASEAN-related acronyms. So that's quite a claim to fame. Then we have Shafia Moiba. She is the head of the Department of International Relations at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. Beg your pardon if I've just butchered your name. I hope I didn't. Previously, she was a senior fellow at the Maritime Security Program here at RSIS as well. And she's a great voice on the links between politics and regional security in Southeast Asia and the wider region. And she can give us a very distinctive Indonesian perspective, I hope, which most of you will know is a rather relevant perspective when it comes to ASEAN matters. And last but not least, we have our very own Prof. Mely Caballero-Anthony here from RSIS. She's a professor of international relations, and she's the head of the Center for Non-Traditional Security Studies here at RSIS in Singapore. Prof. Mely has a great wealth of expertise on many things, but in particular on non-traditional security and the governance thereof in this region. So as you can see, we have gathered great expertise, and I'm sure we will all learn a lot. And on this note, I would like to mention a last bit of housekeeping before we move to Ha. Although you are all muted, dear participants, you may of course ask questions. We actively invite you to ask questions via the Q&A function, and you can also vote with a thumbs up for particular questions of particular interest. Also, I would like to inform you that this seminar is being recorded, and we will put it on YouTube in about 2 days' time, roughly, after it has been processed. So now, without further ado, I hand the virtual floor over to Ha. Ha, please.
Right, and hello to everyone. My sincere thanks also go to RSIS for having me at this webinar. My presentation today will try to address some of the questions that Fred, as the moderator, put forward in this session on multilateralism after COVID-19 or in COVID-19. As all of us have been experiencing it at this very moment, the COVID-19 pandemic is such an overwhelming and all-pervading destructive force. It is as much local as global, aside from the rising death tolls every day and the overwhelming pressure on public health systems. Its damage magnitude has been multiplied through untold economic sufferings to everyone, every business, and every nation. Due to the unprecedented massive scale of the pandemic, nation states have put in place emergency measures that basically seal off their borders from each other. And it remains the case for much of the world and this region. So many liberal trends that we once thought to be unstoppable and irresistible now hang in the balance, including globalization, just-in-time supply chains, open borders, and free movements of people. And on top of these economic disruptions and paradigm shocks, the COVID-19 geopolitical fallouts are equally shocking as the US-China relations are crumbling every day before our eyes. And as the two giants fight, multilateral institutions are among the first casualties. We have all witnessed the predicament of the WHO in the US-China tussle, which has only undermined this organization's capacity in the handling of the pandemic. And unlike other previous crises, all this is taking place in a social distancing environment when we can only meet virtually to sort things out. ASEAN's usual response to crisis situations is to convene high-level emergency meetings among ministers or leaders to work out regional solutions. That was the case of the SARS outbreak in 2003 or the Boxing Day tsunami in 2005. And much of ASEAN centrality has been attributed to its convening power, which begs the question, how can ASEAN make its presence and impact felt in these extraordinary moments? Can digital diplomacy fill the gap? It is one of the questions that is put in this session as well. We all have resorted to virtual meetings made possible by digital communication technologies. Interestingly, within ASEAN, they use Blue Jeans and Google Meet more and hardly use Zoom though. ASEAN has fully embraced digital diplomacy with 2 summits in April and in June, plus 1 back-to-back ASEAN plus 3 summit, plus many ministerial meetings with its dialogue counterparts, the US, China, EU, Australia, Japan, and Russia, among others. Teleconferencing can be useful and cost-effective, especially for technical meetings or in emergency situations like now. And I believe that digital diplomacy will be leveraged even beyond COVID-19. For example, the Vietnamese government has cut down on its budget for domestic and international meetings by 70% this year. And this trend is expected to continue as is realized that many meetings can be done virtually. However, I think digital diplomacy cannot and will not completely replace traditional diplomacy, especially given ASEAN's traditional diplomatic culture. First of all, it's just purely technical. For example, video conference facilities are not synchronized and internet connection is not stable across countries. I have done some interviews on recent high-level video conferences, and it is revealed that some technical hiccup is bound to happen, particularly because of unstable internet connections. Other physical constraints include the different time zones. Getting the right time, for example, to convene an ASEAN regional forum with 27 members, spreading over 6 geographical regions is almost next to impossible. And my friend told me that at a recent East Asia Summit meeting, the chair had to greet everyone in good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and even good night, for example, in the case of New Zealand. Then there is the issue of limited attention span online. And cybersecurity is another concern, especially for confidential negotiations, such as on the Code of Conduct in the South China Sea. Beyond these technical and physical constraints, I think something crucial is missing. ASEAN meetings are not only about statements and photo ops for the leaders and ministers. These annual gatherings provide the facilitative diplomatic ecosystem where many informal, bilateral, trilateral, and even plurilateral engagements take place. And apart from plenary meetings, sidelight activities such as, in the words of the former ASEAN Secretary General Ajit Singh, playing golf together, eating durians, and even doing karaoke, or sightseeing tours or cultural performances have done much to cultivating the bonding among regional leaders, diplomats, and officials. These informal, relaxed settings engender a sense of familiarity and a give and take approach, which in turn facilitates the building of consensus, especially on contentious issues. These conducive elements are missing online. Again, part of this gap can be addressed by technology. I was told that ASEAN SOM or SEOM or their working groups have used WhatsApp communications well before COVID-19 so that their consultation and persuasion can be done online. However, technology can't entirely replace the human touch. Online meetings simply cannot be as interactive as direct ones. The vibe of direct interactions and the pressure of delivery can push the diplomats on the ground to go extra lengths to make compromise and reach consensus. So going forward, I think there is every good reason to continue intergovernmental summits to maintain the momentum of multilateralism. So what now and what next? What are the opportunities for cooperation amidst the COVID-19 disruptions and major power rivalries on the rise? The COVID-19 crisis has exposed the inadequacies and even dysfunction of multilateral institutions, especially in the face of worsening US-China relations. But amidst all this anxiety, I see the silver lining in the heightened sense of emergency on the part of most countries in the world, small states as well as other major powers apart from the US and China, to keep multilateralism alive and going. After the initial shocks and defensive reactions based on worst instincts, countries have got together and hold the middle ground and try to expand it as and when possible. Some recent success stories include, for example, the EU's historic deal on the 750 billion euro post-pandemic recovery fund, or the recent EU-India summit in mid-July, when both sides leaders affirmed their determination to promote effective multilateralism and a rules-based multilateral order with the UN and WTO at its core. As for the WHO, amidst all the earnest calls for the WHO reform, countries continue to rally around the WHO's appeal for $1.7 billion US funding to cope with COVID-19 until December 2020. The total received as of 24 July 2020 has reached nearly 850 million, plus a total pledge of almost 508 million. And it is also noteworthy that ASEAN dialogue and development partners are among the most generous donors to the WHO appeal, including Germany, the EU, Japan, the US, China, Canada, Australia, Korea, Norway, and New Zealand. Within ASEAN, Thailand, Vietnam, and Singapore are also among the donors. As for ASEAN, apart from its high-level digital diplomacy through the convening of summits and ministerial meetings to keep the ASEAN flag flying, what is more noteworthy to me is the shared commitment to keep the borders open for trade, utilize the ASEAN single window and electronic forms to overcome hurdles to trade due to COVID-19 restrictions, and work even harder towards the conclusion of the regional comprehensive economic partnership by the end of this year. ASEAN has also reached out to all of its dialogue partners through multiple platforms to secure their support, not only in fighting the pandemic, but for economic recovery and rebound in the long term. And beyond these practical needs, I think the political messages that ASEAN would like to get across are equally important, namely to keep the spirit and practice of multilateralism alive, to maintain an open and inclusive regional order, and to hold the middle ground for cooperative ends as long and as much as possible, and stay away from the binary choice narrative. However, the ever-deepening rivalry between the US and China does heighten the possibility that ASEAN members will become even more disunited, and ASEAN Plus groupings will be paralyzed. Since ASEAN works by consensus, this principle applies to the broad and diverse membership of ASEAN Plus mechanisms that involve the US and China as well. Inclusiveness is both a blessing and a burden. It engenders a broader legitimacy, but it can also create dysfunction. And this is not a unique ASEAN experience. Broad-based multilateral institutions such as the WHO, APEC, and ASEAN are all struggling under the weight of their membership's diversity. Therefore, as we have been observing lately, the new constructs for the regional cooperation nowadays are more flexible and undefined in form. My colleague Malcolm Cook and I call this informal minilateral options, or the emergence of informal specific issue-specific coalitions that is open to states across the world to join. And some Southeast Asian states, especially Singapore and Indonesia, are among the most active countries in this new form of coalitions. They are members of the 25-country Alliance for Multilateralism, which was launched in last year by France and Germany. Singapore and Indonesia are also part of the ministerial coordination group on COVID-19 that also includes the UK, Canada, Australia, Germany, Italy, Morocco, Peru, and South Africa. And in March this year, Singapore, Brunei, Myanmar joined Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Chile in a joint statement on keeping supply chains open during the pandemic. So moving forward, I think multilateralism will be exercised through a multiplicity of players and layers rather than through a formal institutionalist approach. This would allow for flexibility and timely response. Multilateralism will also have to be more inclusive, genuinely inclusive. As we have seen from the COVID-19 experience, engaging and truly listening to other stakeholders can make a difference. For example, scientists and social society can help in early warning and identifying potential points of failure. And the single most substantial contribution to the WHO funding appeal to COVID-19 does not come from governments, but from the COVID-19 Solidarity Response Fund, which has garnered almost 332 million US dollars from more than 500,000 individuals, companies, and philanthropies. The private sector and philanthropies are also actively engaged in vaccine development, hopefully as a global public good. Moving forward, it would be interesting to follow the trajectory of COVID-19 vaccine development and distribution to know in which direction the world is leaning towards to competitive and zero-sum or collaborative and mutually beneficial. And with that, I would like to end my presentation here and would be happy to answer your questions later.
Thank you very much. That was very, very interesting. One of the more minor but interesting things I learned is that SOM and ASEAN is relying on blue jeans and WhatsApp for communication. That's something that I didn't know. And currently, where tech companies and communication apps are being used for great power competition, this is something very interesting to bear in mind. So thank you very much for this useful piece of information. With this, I would like to move on to Dr. Shafiah, and also once again remind our participants that you can post your questions already as of now, if you have any for any specific participant, speaker, or for all of them. So please, Dr. Shafiah, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Fred. It's a pleasure to be part of this panel. So thank you to RSIS for the invitation to speak here. It's a very interesting topic, and I really thoroughly enjoyed Ha's presentation just now when she explained about the challenges facing ASEAN and having to conduct virtual meetings. I think this is something that a lot of other regional and international organizations are facing at the moment. She also explained that how she is pessimistic that virtual meetings cannot replace physical meetings. I think this is the same sentiment that I think a lot of people here in Southeast Asia are also having. Virtual meetings simply cannot replace physical meetings. So this resonates, the big question, what if this pandemic takes a long time? How can multilateral frameworks, such as those that we have here in ASEAN, adjust to this? If this pandemic goes on for, I don't know, hopefully not over 2-3 years, then, and virtual meetings are not sufficient, then, what are the alternatives? I think to try to understand this, it's important to note that, this challenge to multilateralism comes at a time when multilateralism is not in the best place. This is a trend that has happened at least since 5 years ago. First, there is dwindling trust towards multilateral forum. There's dissatisfaction of the performance of international organizations in dealing with challenges. such as, criticisms towards the WTO with regards to trade war, criticisms towards United Nations in various conflicts and disputes. So this is something that's been going on for quite a few years already. There is also the trend towards unilateralism. More and more states have shown tendencies to seek unilateral measures in foreign policy. For example, imposing tariff, one-sided imposing tariff with regards to trade. And what's interesting is that we can see now more breakthrough and achievements in bilateral and unilateral settings as an alternative to multilateralism. The third trend is populism. This is basically, more and more leaders are now trying to or preferring to please the majority of the domestic constituents. We can see a lot of examples of such leadership now in the US, in India, and Philippines, in Venezuela, and perhaps in Indonesia to a certain extent. The fourth trend is decreasing global leadership. For the longest time, multilateralism has set its foot on, having a major power, being the global or providing the global leadership for this multilateral framework to work, basically. And for the past, I don't know, maybe 5 years or so, we're not seeing this strong global leadership supporting a certain multilateral framework. This is shown by several polls. If you go through various polls in the past few years, the global leadership ratings, the global approval of US leadership, all shows that, basically there is a lack of global leadership at the moment. The US is now somewhat disconnected from important global issues, climate change, regional disputes. It's no longer attending regional meetings, including those in Southeast Asia. In 2019 alone, the US withdrew from 3 major multilateral frameworks: the Paris Agreement, Iran nuclear deal, and TPP. So, and as a consequence of this unilateral and populist policies, it creates this lack of global leadership. Populist policies creates focus on domestic affairs, meaning there's less interest in leading international affairs, meaning that there's less incentive for major countries to resolve disputes to multilateral forum, which means then multilateral forums grow to be more and more unpopular, creating increasing patterns of mistrust among states. And then after that, we face the potential ramifications when it comes to, resolving or managing disputes and conflicts among states. Now in 2020, with all this in the background, COVID-19 has actually intensified this trend. It's not doing it a favor, it's actually making it even worse. First, all states are preoccupied with managing the outbreak within their respective countries, which means that there's less priority to international issues, and all resources that states have are now exhausted for issues related to the pandemic within the country. And secondly, the restriction of movement has also restricted interaction among states as well, as was discussed earlier. Now everything resolves to virtual meetings. States close their borders, which means there are now reduced interaction among states. And I think the serious downside of this is that important meetings and negotiations are now put on hold. In Southeast Asia, we see a lot of trade negotiations being put on hold. The COC talks are now being put on hold. So a lot of important issues are being put on hold until we don't know when. So I think this is one of the dimensions through which COVID-19 has intensified the trend towards less and less interest towards conducting multilateral issues. So so now what about the region? Hayek talked a lot about ASEAN, and it's very helpful in understanding how ASEAN functions and how this has been this has impacted the region quite more on the negative side rather than the positive side. Southeast Asian states need a region with a stable order. I think that's something that is continuously applicable in the region. all states in Southeast Asia needs a stable region, be it Indonesia or Singapore and a lot of the others, as well as to ensure that its borders and sovereign rights are respected by others. And when this, when negotiations to helping create this stable region is put on hold, I think it creates a lot of challenges for states in Southeast Asia. So I think one point that needs to be underlined here is that for Southeast Asian states, multilateral forums are essential. It keeps openness among the countries. It discourages unilateral policies, and it raises more collaborations. Especially in times like now when we have health emergencies, it raises more collaborations, increasing the country's capacity to respond. We see that in ASEAN, looking at the ASEAN experience during COVID-19, we can see the various efforts in the region to work together. And I think this has been explained already. So ASEAN is working to keeping the multilateral spirit alive at the regional level. Although, as many have argued before, perhaps the usual dealings of ASEAN, in this case, meetings, declarations, agreements, do not work in crisis as multidimensional as COVID-19. So that's why, there are efforts to go the extra mile, the extra step towards working together in the time of COVID-19. So in short, the spirit of multilateralism is there, but without a working engine, then we have a problem. And this is not a problem that's exclusive to ASEAN, but also other regional organizations are struggling in a similar manner. So coming to my last point, I think before I end this short remark, we come to the important question. If the spirit of multilateralism is still there, at least in regions such as Southeast Asia, but the appetite towards multilateralism is decreasing, and major powers are seeing it as less and less attractive for their international relations. Could we ever have a multilateral system without a major power? And I think that's a big question. At present, that is currently unthinkable. We in Southeast Asia, in ASEAN, ASEAN is a regional organization, but it strives on the support of major power. And simply thinking about an ASEAN without the support of major power it's not something that's thinkable at the moment. And I think at this point, looking at the current situation in the region, multilateral system without major power is something that's unthinkable at the moment. However, we have for the last, at least 1 or 2 decades, been discussing and freely using loosely the terminology middle power and middle power diplomacy. So the alternative is there and has been put forth by a lot of countries that perhaps if we have middle power countries banding together and practicing middle power diplomacy, perhaps then there can be multilateral system without major power. So for middle powers like those in Southeast Asia, there are policy options, including having this idea of having middle power countries working together. But before we become too optimistic about the future of middle power diplomacy, I think I need to underline again that multilateralism is still the preferred method with the support of major power. Keeping in mind that there are alternatives, building on bilateral relations, building on unilateral engagement, something that also Indonesia has been keenly working on as foreign policy alternatives in the region. So there are, making my last point is that for countries in Southeast Asia, yes, multilateralism is important. It's unthinkable of having it any other way. But I think there are alternatives that need to be seriously discussed more and more in the region. With that, I'll stop and back to you, Fred.
Thank you very much, Shafia. That's very interesting, and I particularly noted your point on ASEAN is keeping the multilateral spirit alive so far, at least in spirit, and I very much agree. And I think this is a large credit here goes to Vietnam as the current chair, who instead of lying low, burying the head in sand amidst the COVID-19 pandemic, have managed to do both, to do a good job at home, as far as we understand from across the borders, and also convene ASEAN meetings, albeit virtually, but at least indeed they keep the multilateral spirit alive, and a great credit goes to them for that. So with this, we move on to our final speaker, Prof. Mely. The floor is all yours.
Thank you, Fred. Thank you to my colleagues at the CMS for asking me to join this interesting panel. The advantage of being the last speaker is that, you don't have to say much because most of it has already been mentioned. But the disadvantage is there's nothing left to say. So let me just see what I can do in the time allotted to me. The general thrust of this panel is really to look at, what it means, what COVID-19 means for multilateralism. And I guess the sense that I got from my the two previous speakers, my two colleagues, is that, despite all the reservations and all the conditions that would otherwise have discouraged or make multilateralism less relevant, actually the opposite is true. That now more than ever, we actually need more strengthened, deeper multilateralism because of the nature of the crises that we face. Just on that, we do face a crisis that's really very, very unique, once in a generation problem, as many have described it. But it's also a crisis that has spawned other types of crises. And when we talk about COVID-19, it's really now, apart from trying to keep ourselves safe, it's really trying to keep ourselves alive and being able to keep our jobs and being able to really live through the very deep and very widespread impact of this global health crisis. So, if you just look at the health and the economic crises, it's really quite profound. And the question, therefore, is the extent to which the multilateral institutions that we have, especially if you want to bring it to the region, is really enough to deal and to help countries and societies deal with this multifaceted impact of COVID-19. As mentioned by Ha and Fifi, we are coming into this crisis with very, against an environment that is really, really very worrying. Why is it important to bring this into context when we look at the future of multilateralism, particularly in East Asia, is because this kind of crisis really requires global leadership. And global leadership, if we think about it in the past, has always been provided by the United States. And in the current regime, there's obviously not just a lack of interest in doing that, but it's the lack of interest and its actions that is actually causing a lot of crises, other tensions that in a way actually prevents us from working towards a more effective solution to COVID-19 and of course the global economic crises. So the lack of leadership and the current regime in the United States are worsening or aggravating the existing problems that we have. But don't forget, we also have within the region, and I think that should be mentioned, it's not just the tension that the US creates vis-a-vis the other power, that's China, but also in light against this crisis, we also worry about aggressive behavior by China. And that is in no way actually helps the region face the difficulty that we actually face. And if multilateralism, the purpose of multilateralism is not just to come up with a collaborative framework, but also to define and to generate norms and codes of conduct to structure interstate relations, we really do have a huge problem. So, in as much as we worry about the impact of COVID-19 on our own societies and our own countries, the future ahead is really worrying, because some of the assumptions that we have about what multilateralism can do is seriously challenged by leadership and challenged by certain behaviors, which then affect the international or regional order that we have. But having said that, I also want to iterate the fact that if you look at multilateralism in a world which is increasingly becoming, our ex-colleague in RSIS, who is now a renowned scholar in the US, talks about a multiplex world where it's not just states that determine the future of the world. It's not just states that provide solutions, but other actors too. International institutions, international foundations, civil non-state actors, civil society groups, etc. Then it allows for a wider analysis of the extent to which the world is trying to cope with the problems that we have now. So however else you want to phrase it, whether, as Ha mentioned, it's like similar to a coalition of interest, perhaps, or they call it a coalition of the willing, or plurilateral interest-based groupings. What you have is a decentralized multilateralism, which actually allows for more flexibility. At the same time, encourage the kind of inclusivity that Ha had mentioned earlier. It also allows for more latitude for options, for policies, and for actions to be taken, because we are facing multiple problems at multiple fronts. So this is where I think, in the context of East Asia, we really see the proliferation of ASEAN-led institutions. You name it, from ASEAN as the core, and then you have the ASEAN +3, the EAS, East Asia Summit. You also have the ASEAN Defense Ministerial Meeting, etc. And even the so-called Quad, or now we call it, the 4 players, and under the rubric of the outlook on the Indo-Pacific, you now have this multipolarity that actually provides us, right, the impetus. It keeps the impetus going for more multilateral efforts to address the problem, not just of COVID-19, but also this global economic problem that we have. At the same time, it allows the other countries to have a voice and to have the space to actually move ahead with some of the agenda, which they think really is very important. So I won't dwell on that so much, because some of my colleagues have touched on that already. But while you have all these multiple, decentralized units, it nonetheless raises the question about the relevance of ASEAN. And of course, there's going to be a special panel on this, about the extent to which ASEAN can still actually take the lead, its central position. Centrality is not just, I guess now, it's beyond being able to convene meetings. And I must say that ASEAN, despite all of these constraints that we have, is actually very adaptable. When Ha says people use WhatsApp, before we had WhatsApp, people were actually using text. It doesn't stop a leader from calling another leader to discuss bilateral problems. So I don't think that gets really in the way. It's the negotiation that perhaps it takes a lot of time, but nevertheless, the adaptability of some of our leaders in the region, allows for that. But it doesn't, as I said, take away the question of the extent to which ASEAN can really hold the center, so to speak, in light of the complexity of problems that we have. So if you want to be very specific about how it has done in the case of COVID-19, I think, as many have mentioned, and it's been written about, there's a lot of commentaries from RSIS that says ASEAN actually has really done quite a lot in terms of, as far as health cooperation is concerned. all of a sudden people were surprised that ASEAN actually had all these mechanisms which were then deployed, which were very critical in helping the region stem the flow of infection, at the same time prevent and mitigate it. There have been some close collaboration, whether it's bilateral or and ASEAN has been able, most importantly, to engage with the external parties, external dialogue partners, for example. So we have, as a result of the special summit in ASEAN on COVID-19, now you have the recovery fund. You've been able to get, in spite of the tensions between some countries with China, you've been able to get China to help out. So in a way, this has been very good. At the same time, you do have also the agreement, particularly as far as trade and investments is concerned, the commitment to keep that open, to ensure also that you have, the idea of ensuring that your medical supplies, the supply chain will not be affected. All of that is very good. And I think it's a good illustration of the extent to which ASEAN can actually move. So if you have that, ASEAN doing these things, but at the same time, you have all of these other groupings, decentralized, which is good. Does it actually compete with what ASEAN can do as a group? That is something that I think we can talk about, or we can toss it out there. Is that actually detrimental, or it actually adds, or it actually enhances the capacity of ASEAN? Because what you don't want at the end is for member states to actually do what we call forum shopping. And that is something that I think we have, ASEAN have to be a little bit more careful, because already the so-called unity of ASEAN has been tested. And it's not just within the 10 ASEAN member states, it's tested within, but also it's tested without, because there are external parties that at one point or another, we have tried to drive a wedge between the 10 ASEAN member states. So it is important the so-called centrality from within is actually maintained in light of all these challenges, whether within the region or outside the region, that is now confronting ASEAN member states. But the other thing that I think I would like to pick on what Fifi has mentioned about the other challenge that sometimes we have not really thought about more seriously is the concern or the growing nationalism that is taking place. And this does not just happen as a result, overnight. This environment would have emerged as a result of the challenges from within member states, and preoccupation to deal with internal challenges also results on perhaps less interest in ASEAN efforts. And it can even get worse in the sense that because of the nature of the crises, as I said, it's not just a health crisis, but it's an economic crisis. And if you look at the prospects ahead, at one point, at some time, the infection or the spread of the disease will taper off. Some epidemiologists will already tell you that, vaccine, maybe it can be managed by therapeutics, but the economic impact is just so widespread and so deep. We're talking about contraction of between 3 to 6%. In Singapore, it's between 4, perhaps to 7%. When you have an economic crisis, we had an experience in 1997 that economic crises can actually result also in internal conflict that then results in more instability. So it's not the instability that's caused by major power competition. It is the instability that could happen as a result of the crisis that we face. Hence, on the one hand, you need to ensure that the momentum of multilateralism is maintained, and that there is no really other way but to go multilateral. But at the same time, you really need to be conscious and to be sensitive to the internal tensions that we all member states in ASEAN are experiencing. And I recall in the 1960s, of course, this is a few years back, national resilience was the main agenda of ASEAN, right? When ASEAN came together, when they had one declaration to say, oh, we agreed to do all this, they then forgot about ASEAN and concentrated on building their own economies as a result of trying to build that kind of a resilience. In this new globalized environment, I don't think we can just say, I don't want ASEAN, but let me concentrate on this. So member states, right, will then have to balance the demands from within about trying to establish, to regain to sustain some kind of development, to maintain some kind of security and stability from internally and also regionally, at the same time trying to balance the tensions from as a result of the external environment. So at multiple levels, multilateralism is challenged. It is by working, and I go back to my earlier point, that I guess in certain issues, particularly now in COVID-19, governments must take more effort to really engage with other actors. And the story of the vaccine is really an important test to the extent to which non-state actors, whether it's the private actors, can come and work together with governments and international foundations to actually help maintain the kind, to help address the kind of existential threat that we face as far as stopping the spread of the virus, and at the same time helping particularly the most affected countries to deal with the multiple challenges that they face. I'll stop there. And maybe we can take some of my points later on in the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. Mely. That was really very interesting. And despite being the final speaker, as you have pointed out, you have managed to fill your time very well with useful information. I must say, one of the points was quite interesting. I've now myself studied ASEAN for quite in depth for over a decade. And even I was surprised by all the mechanisms ASEAN actually had in place once people started writing about it. So this really speaks to at least the quantity of ASEAN mechanisms. About the quality, this is probably something we can discuss now in the Q&A. And the first questions are already coming in quick and hard. But I want to abuse my right here of having the microphone to ask a few questions to you myself, if I may. And perhaps I go in the reverse order of speakers and start with you, Prof. Mely, if I may. There was something that you've picked up on in terms of non-state actors. So multilateralism being state-based and the importance of non-state actors was something you highlighted. And this could be probably everything, I presume, companies, multinational businesses, academic communities, and so forth. And this is also something in your writing, as I know that you pick up on sometimes in your books and your other writing. But I've always wondered, how can you, multilateralism being state-based, how can you involve those kind of actors in multilateralism without being purely silo diplomacy among those people themselves and having virtually no or very, very limited policy impact? Perhaps you could enlighten me on this a bit.
How can you maintain? Sorry, say that again. I didn't get it.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. So how can you engage? How can you include those non-state actors in what is essentially state-based multilateralism, but going beyond just the silo diplomacy, right? Track two, talking to track two, and having virtually no or very limited impact on track one. So how can you integrate non-state actors in multilateralism?
Yeah. Okay. That's a good question. You can do it at various, multiple levels. Let's take the example of the development of the vaccine. We all are very concerned because you have, for example, countries, not just the US, this whole thing about vaccine nationalism, right? That those countries that are able and have the resources can just, block the possible a supply of vaccines once they're available, and they don't care very much about what happens to the rest. And we don't have an agreement as far as the vaccine is concerned. So, but there are institutions that work with governments, like we have, for example, the Gavi, which is that looks at vaccine. It's a vaccine alliance. It works. These are institutions, of course. It's led by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. It's working with other governments that ensure that once a vaccine is ready, they're introducing various mechanisms where they can actually get right? Some agreement among countries and pharmaceuticals and other big corporations to then say, if the vaccine happens, then we can allot certain percentage of that to countries that will need it most. I think it's called the COVAX mechanism. And that, you know, and it's a multilateral agenda when you talk about looking at global health security, but to address that, you need the cooperation of other actors, not just governments. Now, if you bring it down at the national level, right? So you have the government to make sure that you have all these border controls, etc. You have these agreements, but as we can see in Southeast Asia, in countries like the Philippines, which and Indonesia, which is obviously very big population, and have their own challenges with, you know, with trying to stem the flow of infectious diseases. You don't just need your health officials or your military to do contact tracing and to isolate. You need the cooperation of all your other actors, right? Civil society groups to protect those vulnerable and to convince them, right, that they really need to protect themselves while trying to eke out a living. So you need state plus mechanism. So multilateralism, while essentially, you know, one or two, 3 or 4 governments, essentially, the work requires state plus mechanism, right, in an agenda that's very much a multilateral agenda. Right, so I don't see actually the complication. The complication is when you know, states actually do not allow for the participation of other actors to help them. And I talk about the complexity of issues that we have, and this is now we have this now, you know, as a result of, you know, a more globalized environment. You know, you can close your border up to a point, but you cannot stop the flow of infection. Right, you know, we have second wave as a result of travel. Your own citizens coming back. Some countries have been very successful, right? Like Vietnam, for example. But now they worry about the second wave. We have Japan. So you really need that cooperation. And I'm really hoping there is a very good article that if you haven't read it, I'd like to invite everyone to read. It's a foreign affairs article that looks at mechanisms, suggestions to actually allay fears of vaccine nationalism in a world where it's really a crisis of a global crisis of global proportion. If I could get the name of the author, it talks about it, vaccine nationalism. It's one of it is written by Thomas Balke from the Council for Foreign Relations and Chad Brown from the Peterson Institute for International Economics. This is where you can see, right? And nowadays also, if I could just, I know time is limited, but this siloing of issues, health is a major issue where you cannot afford to be siloed because you really need at the governmental level, the cooperation of all your other agencies, and beyond the state, you really need the cooperation of all your other actors.
Thank you very much for the comprehensive answer. Point well taken. Thanks also for the reading advice. Dr. Shafiah, may I turn to you? You said something that you said it more as a side note, but I found it quite valuable. You said it would be important to not put negotiations on hold now currently due to COVID-19. And you were referring specifically to RCEP and even more specifically to the Code of Conduct, if I'm not mistaken. So you said it's kind of on hold, probably because COVID-19, although it's never been really said that it was on hold because of COVID-19, as far as I know officially. But I wonder if this is actually necessary. Do you think you can hold such important negotiations, such as the Code of Conduct or RCEP? Do you think you can hold those negotiations virtually, or do you need those side talks, those trilateral confidence-building talks that our panelists have talked about today?
Thank you. That's a very interesting question, and a question that I've also been trying to ask around to friends who are involved in these negotiations. People say you hold virtual meetings. Why can't you hold virtual negotiations? And apparently for those who are the negotiators, they still still think that it's a different ball game all around when you do it virtually. I mean, I've never done any, formal negotiations, but, I've been told that, there are things that, be it, conversations, the side talks, your cigarette breaks and whatnot. Those are, I think, I've been told that those are some of the more, influential parts of conducting negotiations. We've been told that it's completely different and it's not doable. But on the other hand, like us, watching from the outside, we seem to be, very eager to get, things back to normal as soon as possible. So, if why not try it? And people have also asked that, just try doing some of the, negotiations and see what, how you go from there. But there are reluctance, but I also think that it's not only regarding the technicalities about hosting it virtually. There is also this concern that relates to my other point about, having less resources to spend elsewhere. When all of your resources, all of the, the policies concentration is put into responding to COVID-19, there's, less interest, less appetite to actually go into dealing with other things that, can preoccupy a country a lot. Something as serious as the code of conduct, for example. So the code of conduct is not something that you can hold as a sideline of your other priorities. I mean, it has to be up there. And I think that there's lack of interest of countries to take up such an important decision making at times when resources are exhausted elsewhere.
Thank you very much for that answer. I appreciate it. Ha, finally, back to you, to our first speaker. I wondered, in the experience both in the European Union and in ASEAN, we saw that as a first crisis response, it tended to be unilateral and it tended to be not necessarily concerted action among member states of those respective regional organizations. And you alluded to it at the very beginning of your speech. You said countries sealed off borders and took unilateral measures. My question now to you is, to what extent do you think this has damaged regionalism as such, as an idea, but also operationally, that countries do not resort to regional organizations they are part of, but act unilaterally, a bit slightly chaotic? You saw some countries sealed off borders, others didn't, some did immediately, others didn't, some sealed off the border with China, some did all restrict all international travel, and so forth. So this, what looks from the outside slightly chaotic unilateral response web, has it damaged regionalism in the long term, or has it, can it perhaps be excused because countries need to look first and foremost after the health of their own people? What is your assessment?
I think for ASEAN, in the early days, I think in March is when countries start to take drastic lockdown actions. There was a sense of shock, actually, like where is the regional approach here when all countries resort to national actions in emergency situations. And but then we can see it's not the problem unique to ASEAN. Is very obvious in the case of the EU as well. And to ASEAN, I think the shock is not as deep as to the EU, because ASEAN is never meant to supplant the national action, and it is never meant to overcome the borders. It's only for complementing the national actions. Of course, there is a lot of criticism in those early days, and I think the lesson coming out from this experience is a wake-up call for ASEAN to do more in terms of having, for example, the early warning, regional early warning system, setting up the ASEAN CDC, for example. Obviously, in retrospect, we can see that we could have done more exchange of information. But I think under the exigencies of the moment, I think member states can be forgiven for doing that. And what is more important is that after the first, I think after April, ASEAN countries do get together to try to come up with some regional solutions to the problems.
Thank you very much. Very enlightening. I wonder if I can go now through the ever more questions that are coming in. I believe some of them I can group into one question. Some are asking towards the same effect. Others have just been answered already now. I would like to ask the first question, which is not directed to anyone specifically. So please feel free to answer as you see fit. We have a question here from, and I would like to acknowledge his attendance today, from Ambassador Hoang, Executive Deputy Chairman of RSIS, who's asking us, can sub-regional initiatives in ASEAN, and he's referring here to the Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand Growth Triangle, for instance, or the Mekong sub-region, be minilateral forums without, effective minilateral forums, without undermining ASEAN centrality at all? Another question, can those things coexist? Perhaps would one of you like to take this up? Ha, I saw you raising your hand.
Not minilateral, sub-regional mechanisms have been in existence together alongside ASEAN for a long time. And from an institutional approach, I do not really see that it is threatening to ASEAN centrality. A lot will depend on how much ASEAN is doing to integrate and synergize these sub-regional systems into the larger ASEAN integration frameworks, especially in terms of hard connectivity, what is that called? Roads, highways, and everything, and ports. But from the geopolitical point of view, I think it may, especially in the Mekong region, having a purely functional approach to sub-regional cooperation may be undermining ASEAN centrality in mainland Southeast Asia. So far, ASEAN, whenever there are calls from some corners about ASEAN must take a more proactive role on the Mekong region, the normal excuse is that it's sub-regional and we have mechanisms to deal with it. I think it's just a process-driven answer, or try to not take up this issue when it is, very much a big elephant in the room. So it depends very much on how ASEAN would approach, both from the functional economic development or from the geopolitical point of view, especially when it comes to the Mekong region.
Thank you very much. There are to the same effect, and some are addressed to specific panelists and some are to all panelists, but they're addressing a specific issue, which is minilateralism. The question is it actually healthy or not? And here I would like to acknowledge the question of Alan Chong, head of the Center for Multilateralism Studies here at RSIS. And he's asking a question that has been on the mind of quite a few of our participants, and he's asking Dr. Shafiah in particular, but I think this is a question that can be addressed to all our panelists, as it has been asked by others as well. The question is here really, do you think that minilateralism is actually healthy and forum shopping is actually not detrimental at all in relation to the bigger scheme of keeping multilateralism as such alive? In this regard, these patterns mean that Indo-Pacific states are substituting for the absentee leadership of the United States under Trump, and occasionally in China and Japan as well. So addressed to Dr. Shafia particularly, maybe you can start, but I would like to open the floor to other panelists as well.
Sure, I'll start. I'll try my best to comment. I do think I do think it's not about it being healthy or not healthy. But I do think it's healthy that states have these alternatives when, you know, when all signs towards multilateralism is declining. Doesn't mean that it replaces the other. And going back to, you know, to organizations like ASEAN, we've heard it about being a loose grouping and everything. And I think one of the characteristics of ASEAN, it doesn't forbid any of its members to, you know, engage in different types of interactions, of relations, of, you know, building other types of groupings. And I think this sense of flexibility is a very important characteristic of ASEAN as well. So I do think that unilateral is an alternative for states to discuss various issues or to be engaged in various issues, because we need to keep in mind that ASEAN cannot deal with all issues existing under the sun. So there are certain types of issues that only interest a number of states. There are certain types of issues that it's best not dealt with, you know, through 10 countries. So in a way, you know, at least for countries like Indonesia, unilateralism is something that is seen as a good way when we wish to pursue a certain line of policies that is not dealt with in ASEAN.
Thank you. Mely, you want to jump in, please?
Yeah. Oh, well, if you're talking about working around common interest, we have examples of that. For example, this Malsindo, Malaysia, Indonesia, you know, this cooperation in dealing with piracy, for example. I mean, those countries that are, you know, not literal will have no interest in this. The question, though, and this is a difficult question, and I think ASEAN must really face this, is when goals then, you know, compete, you know, these small groups, the goal of them competes with the bigger objectives of ASEAN, right? And this is really, so when you're talking about the Mekong, whether it is through the Belt and Road Initiative, etc. I mean, we all know that the biggest funder for Belt and Road is China, and, you know, it's such a big presence. And when many of you're talking about 20% of global GDP comes from China, and China, for most countries in the Mekong, is the #1 trading partner of this country. So when it comes then to weighing, you know, certain decisions in ASEAN, and then you weigh that against what you can get, then the conflict comes in, right? And we have that. We had a situation in 2012 when it came to having a joint political stance, right? They couldn't get it, and we know what the problem is. We don't have to discuss that. So there is that risk, right? And when you have all this, you know, while there is that flexibility, I think member states must be very careful. This is what I mean by trying to maintain. You can talk about how ASEAN centrality is in this new environment, right? When there are competing interests, how do you keep the momentum within ASEAN centrality? ASEAN must matter as an organization to its member states. So when it comes to having to decide then, right, whether such a decision will actually compromise, right, the centrality of ASEAN, I think that is a challenge. That is something that must be addressed. And there you can see the commitment. If you are not committed to ASEAN, if you have, you know, if this question of having to then choose, you have to balance national interests with regional interests. But to the extent to which you actually affect the centrality of ASEAN, that is a major cause of concern. And member states, regardless of flexibility, etc., must consider that, because you cannot afford to, you know, in this day and age when there's a lot of pressure nationally, regionally, and internationally, I think it is important, you know, for regional organization to maintain their role. You talk about, you know, has there been disappointment as a result of ASEAN's initial, delay in responding to COVID-19? At one point, there was this concern because suddenly everyone for himself, right? But very soon, you know, they reversed gear, and, you know, you have all this, the special meeting and all these commitments, that is a very clear manifestation that at the end of the day, they realize that it's only by working together, as a group, can they actually address a problem that affects everyone. So there has to be a commitment to keep trade and investments open, to make sure that supply chains are, kept, resilient, right? And then you have to go to specific examples to then say, why does ASEAN matter for a country like Singapore or a country like Indonesia? Because my faith is very much, dependent on the other, right? We are also interconnected. So we have to be worried when there is the competition. It goes against the very objective of what we are as a group, right? Then hard questions, must have some hard answers. So there is always a threat. So talk about, I mentioned it earlier about, while it's good to decentralize, the threat of foreign shopping is always there.
Thank you very much. How would you like to add something that hasn't come up in the discussion so far on this question?
Are you asking me?
If you have something to add, if you would like to.
Yeah, I'm just reminded that by what Dr. Mely just mentioned about the notion of ASEAN centrality. I don't know whether Ambassador meant what ASEAN centrality means in this situation, but to me, ASEAN centrality, first of all, must be ASEAN being central to its member states. And then that is the question, that question would bring me to the notion of one Southeast Asia as an imagined community and the importance for ASEAN to keep working at it. And then the issue of the sub-regional, especially in the Mekong region, is making the overwhelming influence, economic influence of China in the mainland Southeast Asia is actually dividing the region along the maritime mainland fault line. So in that sense, I think there is really a geopolitical challenge facing ASEAN in the Mekong region.
Thank you, Ha. I'm also struck by what there was a nationalism first, there was unilateralism first, but then they came around and actually reversed course. And of course, I have observed this too. And I must say, I've observed this only in two settings, though. I've observed it in the European Union, where it happened, nationalism first, and then they reversed course, and now there's regional cooperation. And in ASEAN, I've noted that here too. So perhaps this is even an argument in favor of greater regionalism. And it also is an argument in favor of ASEAN. What does ASEAN actually do? How does ASEAN matter? So I think this is a very valuable point that has been raised there. Going on here with our question list, I would like to ask a question that has been put forward by Mr. Charlie Brown from the United States, I believe. And he's asking us the question to more specific panelists, to all three of you. Is it possible to say at this point which ASEAN mechanism and forum has been most effective or can be most effective in this new environment? And he's putting forward the East Asia Summit, ASEAN Regional Forum, ADMM, ADMM Plus. He's also mentioning the AHA Center, but is keeping it relatively open. So which one of those ASEAN mechanisms and forums can be most effective in this current environment? Who would like to take this question up first? Prof. Mely, please go ahead.
Let me put it this way, and this is a cop-out answer. Every institution matters in ASEAN, right? But in ASEAN has the 10-country ASEAN has always served as the core for many of this, we call it ASEAN-led institutions. But ASEAN also, as a regional body, recognizes that it has to engage with its dialogue partners. So if you look at the way ASEAN has been conceptualized and how it has evolved over the years, the last iteration of this ASEAN community is that apart from it being, democratic, people-centered, etc., it's also very much outward looking because it realizes that it needed to engage. So when you have the East Asia Summit, that's really at the top, right? It's leaders led, and you have, of course, then you can have very, very important agenda where ASEAN leaders can engage with all the other 8 dialogue partners. You have the regional forum, which is of course the foreign ministers, and then you have the defense, because ASEAN has become so big and it has a lot of agenda, right? And it's a question of what is important, who deals with what. So when it comes to issues of maritime cooperation, in disaster relief, etc., then you have your defense ministers that are actually they're the community that is in charge of that. There was a mention about the AHA Center. AHA Center is the coordinating center for humanitarian assistance within ASEAN. So they have a specific function to fulfill. But so every institution matter, but of course, as when it comes to moving the agenda, it is of course the core, which is the 10 member states of ASEAN itself.
Please, Ha, I see your hand. You would like to add something. Please go ahead.
Yes, I think it's well known that the ASEAN-led regional architecture is very messy, and it has the multiple layers and players, and actually this is part of this is the result of the evolving regional architecture in response to changes in the region after the Cold War. So as Dr. Mely said, every mechanism has its niche capacity, and the involvement of different levels of representation and outside powers provides the flexibility to better cope with the region's regional flux now, I think. For example, we see how the region has been responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. The EAS, the East Asia Summit, which is often hailed as the crown jewel of ASEAN Centrality because it brings together like the US president and the leaders of all the major powers in the Indo-Pacific. But the EAS has been quite absent from the ASEAN Plus cooperation on COVID-19 response. Meanwhile, the APT, the ASEAN Plus 3, with 67 sectoral mechanisms, is better positioned for functional cooperation. And the Plus 3 was born out of the 1997 Asian financial crisis. So it's better equipped to deal with crises and emergencies that require swift actions and ready-made facilities. So, but the important thing is ASEAN, while engaging the APT for practical purposes, does not lose sight of the need to engage all other mechanisms, especially through the +1 dialogue partners, to make sure that every mechanism is used to its niche capability.
Thank you. Yeah, especially ASEAN is of course also quite an exclusive club, right? I mean, being East Asia focused only, and the question is then to what extent does then cooperation take place with others outside of East Asia? Ambassador Hoang has a follow-up question to pretty much exactly what we're discussing right now, and he's wondering how we can energize the ASEAN Regional Forum, or if we cannot, then should we close down the ASEAN Regional Forum? So, in other words, is there any value left in the ASEAN Regional Forum? I see a lot of smiles, so please go ahead.
Shall I?
Please start, Prof. Mely, please.
Yeah. Yeah, with this thing about we just get rid of ASEAN Regional Forum, especially now that we have the EAS, but there's such a thing about, once you create an institution, you don't get rid of it. But it has a function. When it was established in 1994, it was very timely because at the time there was a lot of strategic concern, right, the so-called, the power vacuum in the region. It is important mechanism because it was supposed to be a mechanism that, it was a very significant mechanism to indicate ASEAN's turn towards multilateralism outside Southeast Asia. And it was a way to engage China. If you talk about, when you teach about what the ASEAN Regional Forum is, it's supposed to be a mechanism where you can expand ASEAN's habit of cooperation, etc. I would think, and I would argue, that it becomes even more important now in light of the tensions, that geopolitical tensions that we face, right? And you really have to make sure that, because it's a forum for political and security cooperation in the Asia Pacific. And if you look at the geographical footprint of the ASEAN Regional Forum, 27, 28 members, it's really very vast, and it's really a wonderful forum to discuss all of these things. You talk about US and China, all this belligerence that's taking place on one. You're talking about trying to maintain a rules-based order. This should be in the agenda of the ASEAN Regional Forum. So the question is, why can't, why isn't this happening? Is it because, it's always been ASEAN-led? There's always this complaint that the problem with the ASEAN Regional Forum is, it's still very much dominated by the +10. But there's actually a mechanism in the ASEAN Regional Forum when it comes to the intersessional groups where you actually share chairmanship, right? So, with all of these problems that we have, this is an agenda that ASEAN should really think. How then can we actually revive, make the ASEAN Regional Forum very important? Because this is the only forum which is supposed to discuss all of these political security issues. Of course, there's now the more strategic East Asia Summit. EAS, East Asia Summit, right? But it's still limited to 5/8. And don't forget, it is in the ASEAN Regional Forum where you actually have North Korea as a member. Right, so this is something that is really quite unique. And at one point during the ASEAN Summit in 2017, if you recall, whether they meant it or not, North Korea has actually asked ASEAN to do something about, trying to do something about the impasse that was happening. So there is, I think, a lot of reason why ASEAN Regional Forum should be revived. It's the question, and I don't like to use this term, lack of political will, but if ASEAN really wants to make use of all its mechanism, I think we should start thinking about putting more into the agenda of the ASEAN Regional Forum, other than HADR, Humanitarian Assistance and Disaster Relief.
Would somebody like to add something on the ASEAN Regional Forum? Please go ahead.
I think maybe some people may have wondered whether the ASEAN Regional Forum has served its historical objective, which was right after the Cold War, when ASEAN decided to turn outward looking and to have a strategic outlook from insularity to inclusiveness. And of course, given the emergence of later mechanisms like the ADMM Plus and the EAS, then it has really lost the limelight. And we could see that when we attended the ASEAN Regional Forum plenary. It was really boring and lengthy, and the ministers read the talking points. But I think we should be reminded that the ASEAN Regional Forum has the value in the sense that it addresses traditional security concerns, especially those issues about conflict prevention and non-proliferation. Maybe other issues like maritime cooperation or humanitarian assistance could be better dealt with under ADMM Plus because of its access in practical cooperation. But if we really want to leverage the ASEAN Regional Forum for those traditional security purposes, I think it still has its value. I'm always reminded by the story of Hillary Clinton making her statement on the South China Sea in 2010, which really angered China. But it is from this forum that the South China Sea issue really gained greater international attention.
Yeah, I guess it depends on the foreign minister of the respective foreign minister whether AIF is valuable then or not. Shafia, because you're specifically working on maritime issues quite a bit, would you agree with her that maritime issues perhaps are better placed in ADMM or ADMM Plus and maybe not so much in the AIF? What is your perspective on this?
Oh, that's I think it's never really a preferred way when you sort of like compartmentalize issues in ASEAN, because it seems that everybody would want to discuss everything. I mean, that's how it's dealt with in ASEAN. But it makes sense. I mean, the way that ARF came about and why it was established, the background behind that. I mean, if you want to stick to the ARF as it was designed, then yes, you discuss the hard traditional security issues and leave the others away. But then again, I don't think that's I don't think that is taking benefit of the vast members of ARF that doesn't exist in the ADMM or ADMM Plus. So I think this is a complex situation. But I think setting from the very beginning which issues should be here and not there, I think it's I don't think that's a preferred way. That if we really want to make use of IRF in the future. And I think just to take note of that, I don't think that ASEAN has ever disbanded a multilateral process that it manages, and I don't think it should start with the IRF. No, I don't think so.
I guess we hope that there is still a role for the AIF, because if institutional path dependency is the only thing that keeps the AIF alive, that would be very sad. Okay, maybe we move on to more questions here from our very active participants. Here's one question, quite interesting, from Syed Munadi, who's asking how ASEAN members can deal with the Quad multilaterally. Is there any possibility of ASEAN engaging with the Quad? Perhaps he's referring a bit to Quad Plus or other mechanisms, or maybe even the outlook of the Indo-Pacific to engage the Quad. Has anyone something to say about the Quad and ASEAN in cooperation? Who would like to start? Would anyone like to pick up this question?
Engage with the Quad.
ASEAN engagement with the Quad. Possible, useful, useless, counterproductive.
It's not a formal mechanism as such, as it's just a, they have their own exercises, etc. And I think I was hoping Fifi would answer that, because when it comes to maritime exercises, but the Quad has I think an important this is what we call by a coalition of interest. Talking about resources again, that we can refer to, Rory Metcalf has a very good book on how the Quad can actually, it talks about its usefulness as a body, because it's apart from all this cooperation, it also tries to promote certain, it also tries to reinforce actually some of the norms, international conduct, particularly when it comes to how states should actually behave, whether it is in the maritime domain, etc. The only concern, of course, as you know, in the case of the Quad, is it's actually seen as whether, regardless of how you want to smoothen the edges of the objective of the Quad, it was seen to actually see as a mechanism to sort of contain China. So how ASEAN can sort of engage with the so-called 4 members, they have already engaged by having their own ASEAN outlook, the outlook of us in the Pacific, because it really wants it doesn't want it to be exclusive, it wants it to be inclusive as much as possible, and at the same time to ensure that the agenda is, which brings the 4 countries together, is also as expansive as it can be, but nevertheless point to certain things that the Quad actually has certain advantages. For what it's worth, when you talk about trying to the impact of Quad in restraining aggressive behavior. I mean, I think certain countries in ASEAN is actually quite happy because there are powers in the region that can actually push back, right? And you know, given the fact that certain small, medium-sized countries in ASEAN does not have the kind of military wherewithal that these 4 countries have, then having that there as an informal grouping actually helps maintain, if you like, the stability of the region, and it helps to maintain regional and international order to the extent to which, for as long as it doesn't in a way heighten competition and heighten suspicions among countries in East Asia. That's my long answer to your question.
Yeah, Prof. Mely, I would definitely agree with you there. And it depends a bit on the reputation of the Quad, right? As being seen as a old school containment mechanism or containment dialogue of China, really, in this region. And if ASEAN were to engage with them, this may not be in ASEAN's interest. And yet, at the same time, many or some ASEAN countries certainly welcome the Quad as such, but also welcome not being part of it. Vietnam perhaps being a bit of an exception, and if you think about wider Quad plus forums. Anyone would like to add something on the Quad? Okay, then we move on. We have a question here from Mr. Kogila Balakrishnan, who is, I believe, joining us from the United Kingdom. So very good morning to you. Often there is diffused ownership or diffused leadership in multilateral settings, which is a major problem. And this makes multilateralism less effective in solving critical issues. So the question here is then how to develop capacity for better leadership in multilateralism. So the question here is really, is leadership in multilateralism needed? If yes, how to build this capacity for leadership in multilateralism? I think this is something in your talk, Prof. Mely, that came up as well. So perhaps you would like to start, and other people would like to add.
Yeah, I think given the fact that there are really a lot of agenda on the plate, so to speak, as far as whether it is in trade or investments or in security, then I think diffuse leadership is inevitable, right? It doesn't, you know, just like when I talk about a decentralized multilateralism in trade, you have, of course, the WTO, but if, you know, if trying to address and to advance many of the agenda, you know, in free trade cannot, because of all, you know, all of the different layers and bureaucracies, then some countries actually then opt for, you know, regional free trade arrangements, which, as many economists would say, is really a second best option. In the case of international security, this is where you have the importance of regional organizations, because, you know, they have this so-called what is the term now that they use in the UN? You know, it's like, it's your responsibility, right? So it's like shared responsibility with the UN vis-a-vis the regional organization. And the question, however, is the extent to which you can have that diffused leadership, right, effective. And yes, this is where, if you take the example of ASEAN, the capacity is very important, because how do you in fact lead if you don't have the capacity? But you can define it in many ways. But there's also the issue of credibility, right? It's not just capacity; it is the credibility. And I think in the context of ASEAN, throughout all the crises, in spite of some of its inherent shortcomings, it has been able to have that credibility. And the COVID-19 experience of ASEAN is a very good example where it leads in terms of setting norms, setting standards, right? And ensuring that, and reiterating the value of working together, the value of multilateralism. So, and in this case, I talked about, when you talk, then leadership in specific issues, whether it is in trying to, for example, address the issue of economic governance, global governance, right? So where is leadership at the regional level, at the international level? So I'm trying to remember the term that most people use. It's whoever is best able to address that. Frederick, you should be able to use, it's a term that we use in regionalism, right? Whichever unit that is best connected to it can best able to address this kind of issue. the term will come back to me. So yeah, diffuse leadership is inevitable, but the question is, how do you make the diffuse leadership effective, right? Who in various groups, in various settings, and it's not just leadership that is done by states. It is leadership that can be done by other actors. So again, if you bring it back to COVID-19, right? As far as, you know, the agenda of ensuring that vaccines are actually being able to be distributed in a more equitable basis, the leadership of international foundations like, you know, the Bill and Melinda Gates, for example, working together with the WHO, right, and other private sector, that is diffuse leadership in a way. Do they have the capacity to do that? Yes, they have the capability and resources. Do they have the credibility to do that? Yes, because we have already a history. You can see the extent to which they have been involved in dealing with other infectious diseases like HIV, AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis. So there is that leadership. The problem is when there's diffuse leadership, but there's no capacity and there's no credibility, then it becomes very problematic.
I'm not sure if this is the word you're looking for, probably not, but there is the question of sectoral leadership, right? So in what sector of multilateral cooperation, who takes leadership there? And it should always be the country or the actor that is closest, connected, of course, to that issue and has something to show for as well. So perhaps somebody else would like to add to that question? No? Okay, no problem. Then we move on to the next question. We have a question here from Mr. Kok Liang Chu, who I do not know where he's joining us from, but he's pointing out that ASEAN has always been a very loose grouping. I think something we can all agree on. And the question is, do you think, the panelists, that ASEAN could come together as one sufficiently to navigate US-China rivalry in the region? As well as developing integrated regional policies in dealing with COVID-19 and vaccination. So I think those are two separate questions, but the question really, can ASEAN as a loose grouping actually get together as one and navigate US-China rivalry as it has done before, and perhaps showing some resolve and some cooperation on the question of COVID-19 and vaccination? Would anyone like to pick up this question?
I'll try very briefly though. I think it's the question needs to be more specific. Do we think or do we wish? Well, do we wish? Then of course, I mean, that's the main reason why ASEAN was established in the very beginning. You know, we wish for it to be able to navigate among the big powers, helping us, the countries in the region, to resolve the important issues such as, you know, the one we're facing now with the pandemic. But if the question is, do we think, then it's a completely different question, and it's a lot more difficult to answer. And I do think that, you know, like I said, the pandemic comes at a very tricky time when, you know, there are serious challenges towards not only ASEAN, but, you know, different types of regional groupings. I do think it's a bit far-fetched and optimistic to think that ASEAN would be able to navigate among the major powers. But like I said, the spirit is there, and I think the wish is there, not only within ASEAN, but I think also among the ASEAN partners as well.
Thank you. Before we move on to a slightly different topic that is coming up in the questions, I would like to acknowledge Alan Chong's question. He's posed this question quite early on, and I think the question has been mostly answered already, but he's pointing out that from his own research on ASEAN symmetry and on ASEAN cooperation, on the ASEAN way in general, the diplomatic experience cannot really be mediated electronically. So something we've talked before, do virtual summits actually deliver the same results as physical summits or not? And Ellen is pointing out that even in ASEAN diplomacy, even silences and deflections in person say quite a lot about a specific foreign policy position, which is possibly not to be replicated on Zoom or on Blue Jeans, as is being used in ASEAN more, as I learned today. So this is something I guess we have already talked about, the importance of meeting physically. but I would like to acknowledge it as well. Ambassador Hoang has brought up a new issue, perhaps, that has come up in our talk, but not so far yet in the question. And he's pointing out that populism and nationalism in Southeast Asia, I presume he means, have always been there. The point is, he points out, to have enlightened leadership and good initiatives to minimize the negative effects of such tendencies. What can current leaders in ASEAN, in your opinion, do to counteract populism and nativism in ASEAN countries? Is there something that you would advise leaders to do in order to counteract populism and nativism?
Very difficult question. It's an important question, and I thank Ambassador Hoang for raising that. But it's a very difficult question, especially in a situation where that nationalism, the nationalistic sentiment is coming from the top. So so how can you advise that? ASEAN, one of the success stories of ASEAN, if you recall, is it's being able to socialize thinking, right, within countries in the region. And I think while it, throughout his history since the 1960s, it wasn't much of an issue, because I think at the time there was really that demand from member states in, at least from the ASEAN 5, to really think beyond national, to think beyond nationalism, right? But what is happening is, if you have countries, politicians that think that this is the only way to go, right? That they can actually guarantee their how do you say, the stability of the regime by spouting populist slogans at the expense of the more globalistic, universal orientation, then it becomes a danger. It's a danger because when it comes to, when it is tested, when it comes to the extent to which you then say, okay, this is going to be our position, how are you then able to balance, your own interest, personal interest, against the interest of the region? And are you then able to, to move beyond especially when it comes to different personalities? What we haven't talked about in the context of ASEAN, and I suppose that will be discussed in the other sessions, you have different leaders, generations of leaders. At one point, there was this group of leaders that were very, very close, right? They could pick up the phone and they have that kind of camaraderie. You can even say they're the kind of chemistry, right? But as ASEAN progressed, as the membership became bigger, right? The quality of I think camaraderie has changed, and you can see that perhaps in even in the body language of leaders in the region. It becomes worse if that particular leader, for example, is also very nationalistic in his own thinking and doesn't think like, that doesn't have the ASEAN state of mind, so to speak. You have to be able to be socialized in that, and this is something that we have to work harder, I guess. We should really have bring back more karaoke sessions, some alternative to durian and whatever else. Those were the ingredients that, even if you laugh at it, had actually meant a lot in improving and bringing that ASEAN state of mind. But I just wanted to point out something which I think we also have to bear in mind, this thing about the constraints faced as a result of COVID-19. I would like to think that although they said, COVID-19 is going to be with us for another 1 or 2 years, what we were experiencing in terms of being imprisoned in our own homes, at a certain point, that has got to change. So we are living in this temporary stage, and as I said earlier, despite these limitations, I think people have become actually quite creative, right? You have been able to, there's nothing that stops us because of the wonders of technology by actually getting more in touch. In fact, if you talk about distances among families, it allows us to spend more time now with our friends, because we can easily contact them via via Zoom or via Nets or via WhatsApp, etc. So it's a state that should not in any way get into affecting the gains or the momentum of multilateralism. So we have to be careful by being so definitive to say, it's really going to affect it, because it is a stage. It is a stage that has to be really managed and managed well. And I guess, regardless of, even silences, you can see your expression and all that. Alan has a point, right? But, we are all human beings, and we desire that social interaction. And of course, but sometimes we have to work with the second best option. And this is what we're trying to do. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mely. On this note, I think we can bring this to a close. Sorry for going slightly over time, but it was quite interesting questions, quite an important discussion. And I completely agree with you, Prof. Mely. I would have liked to hold this as a physical conference at our premises at RSIS as well. And webinars are great, but they're only the second best option. So I hope we all get out of this. Nonetheless, as long as we're still in this COVID-19 malaise, please, everyone, feel free to sign up to our to the continuation of this webinar series for our next 2 days, same time, same place. And thank you very much to all of you dialing in from across the world. I think we have learned something about the value of multilateralism. We've learned something about multilateralism actually working, at least when it comes to COVID-19, and I think this is a positive note to end. Thank you to all of you, and with this I sign out. Stay well, stay healthy, stay clean. Goodbye.